Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for coming to this panel for Living with Water. I am Paola Yuli. I am a PhD candidate at Howard University, and I will be chairing this panel. So today you are attending the On Managing Water 2 panel, and we have two presentations, as Julia mentioned. Simone will be here, so we will be hearing from two lovely presenters. We will be starting with Simone Edgar Holmes, but before that, I just wanted to mention that each presentation will be 15 minutes long. Please wait to ask your questions until the end of all of the presentations. There will be 20 minutes for discussion where you can ask all of your questions. So starting with Simone Edgar Holmes, who will be presenting a paper titled Hydrocolonialism and Cartographic Power, Water in Dutch Cape Town, 1652 to 1795. Simone Edgar Holmes focuses on the intersection of critical cartography, eco-criticism, and the history of the Dutch Empire in the Atlantic world. She holds a BA in art history from Middlebury College in Vermont and an MA from the Courtauld Institute of Art, where her research focused on the spatial histories and legacies of the Dutch and British empires. Her dissertation, emphasized the ways in which these European powers harnessed water infrastructures and management techniques alongside mapping practices to support their imperial agendas abroad. In her forthcoming PhD research, she will examine the colonial water history of Dutch Suriname, a Caribbean plantation colony, and propose a new eco-critical methodology for reading maps as sources of early modern environmental understanding. Simone also works as a historian for National Geographic Lindblad expeditions, where she delivers lectures on art, architecture, and history to non-academic audiences, and leads tours of historic sites across coastal Europe and Canada. She is also an editor and researcher, contributing to books such as Flowers and Their Meanings by Karen Uzele, published by Penguin Random House, and curatorial initiatives like the Digital Catalog of Early Modern Dutch Prints at the Middlebury College Museum of Art. Please join me in welcoming Simone Edgar Holmes.
Thank you very much. Trust you're all seeing the appropriate screen. Wonderful. Thank you all for joining me, and Paola for the introduction, and Sam and Julia for organizing this panel. So as Paola mentioned, my research combines the study of water history with both colonial history and cartographic studies, which analyzes the design and meanings of historical maps, and also understands that maps were a crucial instrument of the colonizing process, that were not only able to project, but also create power and claim land possession abroad. So for this study, I focused on two regions and cultures whose entire history has revolved around an intensely intimate relationship with water, which brought both great authority and significant danger at various points. So the first culture is the Dutch, who inhabited a very small territory, highly prone to flooding due to almost a third of their land lying below sea level. They were therefore forced to become experts in hydraulic engineering and build a complex system of dikes, canals, and reclaimed land in order to survive. Their mastery of seafaring also allowed them to travel across the world and claim lands overseas, which expanded their power far beyond what might be expected for such a small and vulnerable country. By doing so, the Dutch performed what Carrie Bistrom and Isabel Hofmeyr have termed hydrocolonialism, which includes colonization via water, such as maritime imperialism, colonization through the control of water, such as flooding and damming occupied land, and colonizing water itself, such as by claiming water resources and changing water flows. One of the many areas that the Dutch impacted through these means is the South African city of Cape Town, which began as a Dutch stopover point or refreshment station in 1652 because of its abundance of accessible fresh water. But it's now known for experiencing a nearly devastating water crisis from 2015 to 2018, which made it the first major city in the modern era to face the threat of completely running out of drinking water. So in this presentation, I'm focusing on the origins of colonial Cape Town, and we'll examine how the Dutch used both their expertise in water infrastructure and propagandistic map making to assert and maintain colonial authority over the contested and often highly resistant South African landscape. This modern day map here shows all of the global territories that were at one point in time part of the Dutch Empire. You can see that wherever the Dutch established outposts, they did so along coastlines or estuaries. And one of the first areas that they colonized was the city of Batavia, or modern-day Jakarta in Indonesia, which they razed to the ground and rebuilt as the location of their capital in the area they renamed the Dutch East Indies in 1619. But the voyage from Amsterdam to Batavia took between 5 and 7 months, which was far too long to go without stopping for food and fresh water. So they needed to construct a refreshment station halfway. And it was with this goal in mind that the Dutch East India Company directed Commander Jan van Riebeek, depicted here, to, quote, inspect the locality of the fresh river and search for the best and fattest ground in which everything planted or sown will thrive. When von Riebeek and his 3 ships landed on the Cape Peninsula on April 7th in 1652, he wrote back that the region was, quote, so fertile and rich, no other colony could be compared with it. This here is one of the earliest Dutch maps of the Cape, dated to that initial year, 1652, and it conveys this perceived fertility of the region. It's attributed to Caspar van Weyde, who was the first cartographer known to have worked at the settlement, but it's unclear whether map maker was ever an official position at the Cape as it was in some other Dutch colonial areas. In this map, you can see that the smooth, rounded shoreline of Table Bay, which was named after Table Mountain, the flat-top mountain in the distance, implies this calm, idyllic pool at the heart of a harmonious and ecological system. From the center spread concentric circles of streams and mountain ranges, and between them the unshaded valleys are identified in the legend as, quote, large, beautiful meadows entwined with many freshwater rivers perfectly suited for agriculture. But despite this description, there's no indication of greenery in the map. But this doesn't appear to reflect the poor fertility of the region, and instead suggests that the value the Dutch placed on water alone viewed it as a sufficient sign of a lush environment. So this map, along with most of the others that I'll look at throughout this presentation, were not distributed widely or publicly, but this one was sent to the Dutch East India Company headquarters in 1653, and they used this map and others as a promotional tool to convince shareholders of the profitability and progress of these operations. But both this map and the accompanying reports hugely exaggerated the fertility, the stability, and the safety of the area, which instead had a very harsh climate, uneven soil conditions, seasonal extremes that caused both floods and droughts at differing times, and such bad weather that it gave the Cape its nickname, the Cape of Storms. But by sending such an overly optimistic imagery back to the Netherlands, von Riebeek's aim was to convince the East India Company of the ease of cultivating and governing this new settlement, because he selfishly wanted to be posted to a more official and prestigious colony instead. The lands surrounding the settlement were, of course, also not uninhabited, as most maps of this period appear to imply with their empty, unmarked landscapes. The valley where the Dutch settled was a regularly visited region by the indigenous Khoikhoi, who were transhumant pastoralists who herded their cattle and sheep to follow the rains and freshwater streams. Despite receiving instructions to not commit violence against the indigenous people, the Dutch disregard of their impact on Khoikhoi livelihoods provoked tensions from the beginning. Although the Dutch distinguished their refreshment station from a colony, they still believed that they had a claim to the land, and they validated this by their construction on the site and also their mapping of the area. Unusually, this map, which was made by Peter Potter around 1658, does subtly acknowledge Khoikhoi presence, but only when the symbolic language of early modern cartography is understood. This small circle surrounded by a concentric circle of dots indicates a kraal, or a temporary Khoikhoi village. These are marked more explicitly in a later map by Isaac de Graaf, but now they're pushed back into the hinterland on the right, and that's indicating how the Dutch expelled the indigenous people from the peninsula following 3 wars in the first decades of their settlement. This representation of indigenous settlements, which positions them permanently in specific locations, also betrays the Dutch misunderstanding of the Khoikhoi relationship with the land. The Khoikhoi practiced seasonal communal grazing and managed the environment through controlled burning, but they didn't alter waterways or build permanent structures, so the Dutch didn't recognize the Khoikhoi's ecological stewardship as a sign of ownership worthy of mapping. Apologies. In the sheltered valley to the south of Table Bay, where the Khoikhoi were used to grazing, the Dutch quickly constructed a fort and a large garden, shown here by the gridded rectangles, and they began expanding their settlement immediately upon landing. This map, also made by Peter Potter, removes the settlement from the context of its surroundings and reduces it to the shapes of streams and scattered buildings on a really flat, undefined surface. He only draws water. The land is merely presented by negative space, and that creates this land-water dichotomy that is really central to the language of maps generally, but in particular highlighted here. The key also indicates the different uses for water in different areas. The letter O, circled here, is a small dammed freshwater pool at the base of the Platteklip River tributary and is labeled where men collect water. But it contrasts with P, which is labeled as the fresh river into which the ditches of the company's gardens drain. So this division of water use points to the Dutch control of both water flow and consumption, and cartographically represents the policy against water pollution that von Riebeek instated at some point before 1657, which explicitly forbade washing or urinating upstream from the water collection point. Now, above letter P, in the section of the river between these two sluice gates, Potter drew an unusual double line, which probably illustrates the higher water level when the bottom gate is closed, but the top sluice remains open. But instead of revealing a lack of control over water levels causing flooding, this double line probably indicates a highly regulated region between two very carefully constructed sluices. Outside of the area, there's only single water lines, so these imply a consistent level of hydration throughout the settlement, demonstrating a degree of control obtained through these carefully designed elements of water infrastructure. So while concealing political instability in colonial regions was a common practice in Dutch cartography that is widely acknowledged among cartographic historians, environmental instability in maps is far less recognized and discussed. In the colonial period, although a lack of control would not be acknowledged in maps, the desire to continually update the landscape was frequently emphasized. This practice was based on a Dutch belief that continuous construction and control of the natural environment, which was seen by Europeans as improvement, constituted a sign of legitimate territorial ownership. But despite this belief, after only 6 years at the Cape, the Dutch were no longer themselves building or maintaining waterways, but began importing enslaved laborers from Eastern Africa and later also Indonesia, India, Madagascar, and Mauritius. And these laborers caused plenty of instability of their own by starting 3 separate fires and devising a plot to poison the public water supply. But none of their presence or effort is directly acknowledged in any maps. These laborers would have also been responsible for reconstructing this reservoir, which was one of the first structures to be improved from a small circular pool to this deeper brick-lined cistern. The reservoir was designed and drawn by von Riebeek's successor, Zacharias Wagenaar, and even though it was hastily built to combat an impending period of water scarcity, the urgency and desperation involved in the process are not apparent in this highly celebratory map. To the right, Wagenaar included the previous water pool, making this upgrade clear in the direct comparison between the old and new designs, which exhibits the engineering success of this new reservoir. In the following century, the Dutch retained their rule over the Cape, but never claimed it as an official colony and produced far fewer maps. One of the latest maps from within the Dutch period is this one, Robert Jacob Gordon's 1782 map, which may or may not have been commissioned by the East India Company. In this new rigidly gridded cityscape, which was created after the colony's brief period of growth in 1767, the natural environment becomes overshadowed by this fully controlled built environment, but the waterways that flow into the city are still clearly illustrated. But hidden behind this confident image was the reality of the Dutch East India Company's financial and political situation. By the end of the 18th century, the once dominant East India Company was nearing bankruptcy and had no money to fund any new construction. They had also never prioritized the Cape in the first place and had even stopped supporting building projects after the 1660s. So the water supply system was in serious need of cleaning and upkeep by 1790. The city was also facing a drought, and many of the defensive works projected on this map, such as these labeled B, C, and D, weren't finished in time to repel the British, who invaded the unprepared city in 1795. As can be seen in these later maps from the British period, beginning in the first decades of their rule, the Cape's new occupiers gradually filled in the city's polluted canals, replacing them with brick sewers until the last open water course was covered in 1901. Although some waterways still existed above ground in 1827 when this map was created, they're not a primary landscape feature as they are in all of the Dutch maps. They're not colored in blue, and they're hidden among these dark, dominant buildings. For the British, buildings and settlements were proof of colonial land claims, but for the Dutch, water was absolutely central to both the language of their maps and the physical construction of their colonies. So to conclude, looking at the history of Cape Town and other similar colonies through the lens of hydrocolonialism captures these complex ways that the Dutch used water to dominate and transform foreign environments, colonizing by way of water, through the control of water, and water itself. By combining the colonial tools of simultaneously hydraulic engineering and colonial mapping, the Dutch used this new visual language of water to both project and produce authority over a contested and often resistant landscape. And to quickly hint at my future research, which Paola also mentioned in my introduction, I'm intending to test out all of these observations on Dutch hydrocolonial and mapping practices on other colonial regions, in particular in Suriname, which is a plantation colony on the Caribbean coast of South America, where various indigenous groups, enslaved Africans, and escaped Africans known as Maroons, all interacted with the same waterways in radically different ways. So it's my goal to develop a specific methodology for reading these historical maps through an environmental and primarily eco-critical lens to better understand how early modern people perceived and also used water in colonial contexts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simone, for your presentation. That was wonderful. Okay, so following Simone, we have Jack Love, who will be presenting a paper titled The Disruptive Mississippi River Erosion and Shoaling in the Works of Mark Twain. Jack Love is a PhD student in the English department at Texas A&M University, where he studies American literature of the 19th century. He is specifically interested in the representations of waterways from this period and how they serve as contested and disruptive environments. He has presented work at conferences that include, the American Literature Association and the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment. He has also published work in venues including the Oxford Handbook of American Street Literature, Christianity and Literature, and the Journal of the Georgia Philological Association. Please join me in welcoming Jack Love.
Thank you. Thank you, Paola, for that introduction. And I want to also extend my gratitude to Sam and Julia for organizing this event and for including me in it. I am very happy to be here today with you. The paper that I am presenting today is titled The Disruptive Mississippi River, River Erosion, and Shoaling, and the works of Mark Twain. In his 1883 memoir, Life on the Mississippi, Mark Twain describes the mighty Mississippi River as remarkable in its disposition to make prodigious jumps by cutting through narrow necks of land and thus straightening and shortening itself. Its erosive power alters the surrounding lands, constantly transforming the geographic territoriality of those U.S. states that use the river as a demarcated boundary line. Twain writes, a plantation set on the river may one day be submerged beneath its waters. An abundant river town may be thrown out into the rural districts, and a resident of Louisiana may one day awake to find that they now live in the state of Mississippi. Most interestingly, the river's erosive powers, according to Twain, in the antebellum period, could have transferred a slave from Missouri to Illinois and made a free man of him. Twain pictures the Mississippi River as a forceful body of water that magnifies the instability of American territoriality, commerce, social structures, and racist systems by disrupting them. It is not just Twain's Mississippi that performs this action. There are many representations of inland waterways in American literature that function as environments that magnify the fragile nature of various American systems. In this presentation, I will analyze the role the Mississippi plays in two of Mark Twain's texts, Life on the Mississippi and The Adventures of Huck Finn. Life on the Mississippi, which is Twain's memoir from his experiences living and working in the Mississippi River region as a steamboat pilot before the American Civil War, depicts the mighty river as an environment too powerful for human control. Early in the memoir, Twain explains that the erosive capabilities of the river leads to what he terms cutoffs. A cutoff, Twain writes, plays havoc with boundary lines and jurisdictions. It occurs when the river carves through the surrounding landscape, reshaping its route to the ocean. The powerful water cuts through the earth and terrain, changing the very landscape over a time period. Lands that may have been formerly above water now sit submerged beneath it. Towns reliant on the river as a central infrastructure may lose access to the waterfront, or the town itself may fall into its vast waters. Because of cutoffs, experienced pilots like Twain had to be constantly vigilant in their study of the riverway. Twain even notes that as soon as a pilot assumes they know all the bends and currents of the river, they are prone to falling victim to a newly formed cutoff that may have formerly been deemed safe, deep water. These cutoffs, as Twain calls them, are utterly unpredictable, and they are capable of severely hindering travel and commerce that is solely reliant on the riverway. Twain offers many examples of the havoc that river cutoffs cause, but the most fascinating is his illustration of how the waters could have undermined enslavement in the American South prior to the American Civil War. Let me return to the quotation that I cited earlier. Twain writes, such a thing happening in the old times, that's the antebellum period, could have transferred a slave from Missouri to Illinois and made a free man of him. This quotation is telling because in the antebellum United States, territoriality became a primary concern between pro-slavery advocates, abolitionists, and free soilers. Westward expansion, colonial expansion became fraught with political conflict whenever territories like Missouri or Kansas requested admission to the Union. After the Compromise of 1820, Missouri was admitted into the Union as a slave state under the stipulation that all other territories north of the Mason-Dixon line would be free states. This compromise, of course, would be undermined by the popular sovereignty ruling that went into effect in Kansas and Nebraska just 30 years afterward. Nonetheless, the boundary between Missouri and Illinois, which is the Mississippi River, became a boundary line separating slave territory from free territory from 1820 until abolition in the 1860s. Yet, as Twain notes in his memoir, the river was and still is constantly changing its own shape and thus changing the lands surrounding it. The boundary line between the slave state of Missouri and the free state of Illinois is in constant flux, which ultimately complicates the complex and conflict-ridden geographic territoriality of the antebellum U.S. I argue that Twain's illustration of the Mississippi River cutoffs reveal two things. First, Twain's Mississippi vividly indicates how geographic mapping and territorial divisions are never absolute, even if they are described in totalizing language, which is an obvious. And then second, Twain's Mississippi conveys the underlying indistinction between slave and free states in the U.S. prior to the American Civil War. Boundary lines are arbitrary, and when a mighty river becomes one of these arbitrary demarcations, the very judicial, residential, and racial systems in each state are revealed to be wholly unstable. Indeed, an enslaved person who crosses from Missouri to Illinois by way of the Mississippi River is not immediately safe from racist legislation. They are certainly not free, and after legislation like the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, formerly enslaved peoples in the northern United States could be captured and returned to enslavement in the South. As I will later show, Jim, the runaway enslaved character in Twain's Adventures of Huck Finn, experiences this instability of U.S. territoriality when he tries to escape from Missouri to Illinois down to the Ohio River by way of the Mississippi. In addition to these cutoffs, Twain also notes what he calls Mississippi River towheads. Towheads, Twain explains to us in The Adventures of Huck Finn, are sandbars that have cottonwoods on it as thick as harrow teeth. These geographic features are unruly places with overgrowth and unstable grounds that constantly threaten to give way to river currents surrounding it. While Huck and Jim benefit from the ample sandbars of the Mississippi, steamboat pilots and white river town folk, greatly fear these sudden land features that arise from the river's depths. In Life on the Mississippi, Twain explains why. Upon his return to the region in 1882, Twain repeatedly claims that he is shocked by the river's difference. He claims he hardly recognizes portions of the river he frequently traveled as a pilot just 20 years beforehand. Visiting the small town of St. Genevieve below St. Louis, Missouri, Twain writes, "I wondered if I had forgotten the river, for I had no recollection whatever of this place, and the shape of the river, too, was unfamiliar." Years beforehand, Twain traveled up and down this very stretch of the Mississippi as an apprentice pilot. Twain knew the river well in those days, but as we once again see, the mighty stream has completely changed its course. In his early days, Twain notes, St. Genevieve was a thriving river town that was wholly reliant on its unmitigated access to the river currents for travel and commerce. It was an old French settlement, and it had served as a waypoint for settler colonial peoples for at least a century. Upon returning to that general region years later, however, Twain doesn't recognize it. Indeed, he is perplexed by the numerous passengers who plan to debark from the ship for a large town which lay shut behind a towhead. He writes, "I couldn't remember that town. I couldn't place it, couldn't call its name. I suspected that it might be St. Genevieve, and so it proved to be." The reason Twain can immediately recognize the old river town is because of the towhead, which Twain here also calls a new island that impedes its access to the mighty Mississippi. He further explains, "Observe what this eccentric river had been about. It had built up this huge, useless towhead directly in front of this town, cut off its river communications, fenced it away completely, and made a country town of it. It is a fine old place, too, and deserved a better fate." As we see in this description, Twain describes the river as a dynamic force capable of changing the very geographic territoriality of the American heartland. Twain calls the Mississippi an eccentric river that is capable of building its own towheads without regard for how it might impact human settlements. It is disruptive because humans cannot ultimately hinder its progress. Finally, Twain describes the towhead in front of St. Genevieve as useless. It cuts off the town from river communications, it fences it in away from the rest of the American world, and it transforms the town into a country place. In this picture Twain paints, towheads are pesky landmasses that wreak havoc on river traffic and infrastructure. Economically, they offer no value because they're unstable and typically temporary. For Twain, then, Mississippi towheads oppose American commerce, travel, and infrastructure. They actively stand in the way of cohesive, connected townships on the river, and they even threaten the health of towns displaced by the river's erosive powers. If this element of the Mississippi is partially detrimental to American infrastructure and economy in the 19th century, then it is a useful natural force for those who wish to resist or undermine American hegemony. Jim, the runaway enslaved man in Huck Finn, employs these or uses these eccentric elements of the Mississippi River for just this very purpose. Huck first encounters Jim on Jackson's Island shortly after both flee from their river town in Missouri. Huck flees because of his violent father, and Jim flees because he overhears his owner negotiating a price to sell him down river into the deep American South. Huck describes the island as heavy timbered and standing up out of the middle of the river, big and dark and solid like a steamboat without any lights. Despite its solid position in the middle of the river, people rarely visit this island, nor does anyone live on it permanently. And for a while, this island seems to be a great refuge for the two, but it doesn't last. After spending several days on and near the island, Huck paddles over to the Illinois shore of the Mississippi, dressed as a young girl so as not to draw any unwanted attention. Once he arrives on shore, he immediately determines to visit a house where he believes he might be able to learn recent news about the surrounding region, including whether authorities are still searching for Jim. Speaking with an older woman who lives in the house, Huck learns rather shocking news. Because the authorities believe Huck to be dead, they place the blame on Jim due to his mysterious disappearance on the very same night. To many of the residents in the surrounding area, Jim's flight proves his guilt and death, but this is not even the worst part of the news Huck learns. As he converses with the older woman, she explains that she thinks Jim is hiding out on Jackson's Island because of its remoteness and because she was pretty near certain she'd seen smoke over there about the head of the island a day or two before. In fact, she is so convinced Jim is hiding on the island that she has sent her husband down the river to hunt around on the place. After all, she exclaims to Huck, the $300 bounty on Jim's head doesn't lay around for everyday people to pick up. Panic-stricken that his runaway friend may be captured on the island, Huck hurries back to Jackson's Island and they escape without any further conflict. But this moment in the narrative shows us the danger of Jim's position on the Mississippi River. It may offer him hideouts and spaces to resist the institution of enslavement in the antebellum American world, but it also leads to wide-scale manhunts that extend across state lines. After the near catastrophe, Huck and Jim float downriver and take up camp on towheads instead. This Jackson's Island scene further complicates the territoriality of the Mississippi River and its surrounding regions in the antebellum American world. Huck visits the Illinois shoreline of the river, a supposedly free state. He does not visit his Missouri hometown where slavery is legal, yet news of his apparent death and Jim's flight has extended across the waters. Hence, the problem of enslavement is felt in all of the states, free and slave alike. And as we see with this elderly woman, some white Illinoisans take advantage of the economy of enslavement despite their supposed free state status. Jim's escape from slavery seems much bleaker in this moment. His main route of escape, crossing the Mississippi from Missouri to Illinois, is rendered arbitrary. In the words of Donald Pease, Northern aid in Southern enslavement renders the entire U.S. nation one large geographic zone of indistinction, where the difference between slave and free state means nothing. Huck and Jim float downriver during the night to escape Jackson's Island. And when dawn begins to break the next morning, the two tie up to a towhead in a big bend on the Illinois side. Covering their canoe with brush and branches, Huck and Jim lie in the cottonwood thickets of the towhead where they watched rafts and steamboats spin down the Missouri shore and upbound steamboats fight the big river in the middle. They watched the river traffic in complete safety because, as Twain notes in Life on the Mississippi, towheads are useless. They actively hinder boats and towns. And while various vessels stick to safer waters, Huck and Jim take their canoe into the portions of the waterway where they cannot be easily followed. The towhead essentially offers Huck and Jim temporary respite from their downriver journey. It offers them a hiding spot in daylight hours where they can rest, eat, and observe the surrounding country without fear of capture. Though they only remain on this towhead for one day, it offers Jim enough time to gather his wits about him after fleeing Jackson's Island in a hurry. In this way, the towhead that they land on operates in a manner consistent with the Black Shoals of Tiffany Lethabo King. The Black Shoals for King are both geographical land features and theoretical concepts that allow for Black studies scholars to envision how African diasporic thought resists settler colonial humanism in New World context. She writes, the shoal, like Black thought, is a place where momentum and velocity as normal vectors are impeded. It is a place where an adjustment needs to be made. As an in-between ecotonal, unexpected, and shifting space, the shoal requires new footing, different chords of embodied rhythms, and new conceptual tools to navigate its terrain. As geologic features, the shoal also disrupts colonial geography, scales and measures that separate the land and the sea. While the shoal as a theoretical concept is incredibly valuable, my interest in King's definition in this particular paper is more invested in the geographical and the geologic. As she clearly explains, shoals disrupt settler colonial topographies. Mississippi towheads, like any shoal, are temporary sandbars. They serve as a hindrance to a white supremacist society that utilizes waterways as infrastructures for the plantation economy. In Huck Finn, these river towheads operate according to the same logic. They are biophysical spaces that quite literally enable Jim to keep up his resistance to the plantation economy that pervades the waters of the Mississippi. In Twain's most famous novel, Jim utilizes the Mississippi River towheads as a form of Tiffany Lethabo King's Black Shoals. When Huck and Jim depart from their life-saving towhead that night, they quickly determine that these towheads are the safest land features to evade detection. Over and over, the two runaways make camp on river shoals across vast miles of the Mississippi River. For the most part, these shoals offer Jim a space of rest. Huck, of course, has much more privilege than Jim, and he frequently leaves him on a towhead and travels into various towns that line the banks of the river. Ultimately, it's this method of travel that leads to Jim's unfortunate recapture. So in the end, as Toni Morrison notes, Jim is never meant to escape to freedom. As she writes, quote, there is no way, given the confines of the novel, for Huck to mature into a moral human being in America without Jim, end quote. Huck can only define his status as a free individual in the presence of one who is not. And for this reason, Jim's escape from enslavement is set up for failure from the outset of the novel. As Morrison notes, white characters in American fiction need Africanist presence. They can only define themselves in contradistinction to the Africanist figure. Even if this may be true, and it is true, the Mississippi River towheads in Twain's acclaimed novel are unique geographic features that allow Jim to perpetually resist the white supremacist world of the antebellum US, at least for a time. And it is his relationship to Huck Finn in the end that holds him back from truly escaping. Analyzing both of Twain's texts with particular focus on the Mississippi's erosive power allows us to see the fragility of white American culture, commerce, and travel. The very environment central to America's expansion west also actively undermines settler colonial projects that line its banks. And as we see with Jim, the dynamic nature of the mighty river allows for marginalized people groups in antebellum America to resist and at least find temporary security in its ever-changing environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack, for your presentation. Thank you both for your presentations. Simone, for your conversation, opening up conversation on colonial infrastructures and waterways in Dutch colonial empire the empire presence both in Cape Town and also with your future work on Suriname, and Jack for your conversations. And I'm seeing linkages between the two on colonial infrastructures and waterways, the kind of perhaps parasitic relationship between natural environments, natural waterways, and colonial infrastructures.